Hello, everyone. This is World Review with Ivo Daalder, a weekly look at news from around the world, produced by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It's Friday, August 16. Here's what we have on tap this morning. A surprise invasion of Russian territory, the first such incursion since the end of World War II. Ukrainians surprised everyone, Russia and the West alike, in launching a major offensive into the Kursk region and continues to advance its forces while beginning to dig deep to hold the territory it has seized. What is Ukraine hoping to achieve, and what is the impact of this offensive on the war? Then, feverish negotiations in Doha with top officials from Israel, the United States, Egypt, and Qatar continue today to negotiate a ceasefire and hostage deal in Gaza. Everyone sees this as the last best hope to avoid a major regional escalation that would involve Hezbollah and Iran, as well as many other actors. But will Hamas and the Israeli right, both of whom seem to oppose this deal, scupper it, and will the war therefore escalate? And then finally, the FBI announced that Iran had sought to hack presidential campaigns of both American political parties. This is just the latest indication of digital warfare surfing bigger goals. Much of the dis and misinformation is being amplified in social media platforms that really remain beyond the government regulation and control. So how is this information and disinformation, this hacking, this new digital warfare affecting not just politics on the ground, but how societies should react and deal with it? Here to talk about these issues are three reporters who cover these stories. Ravi Agrawal, editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy; Stefan Kornelius, political editor of the Süddeutsche Zeitung; and Carla Anne Robbins, senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and formerly of the Wall Street Journal and New York Times. Good morning, Carla, Ravi. Good afternoon, Stefan. Wonderful to have all three of you back on the show. Stefan, let's start with you. Really remarkable last 9 days. We have seen Ukraine doing some incursions, but they tended to be raids across the border that ended pretty quickly. This was a big one, very much timed to catch everyone by surprise, including many of the Ukrainian forces themselves involved in this effort. How do you read what is happening in Ukraine, and what do you think the goal was and what the impact will be?
Well, tons of question, tons of speculation right now, especially since all sides are extremely tight-lipped about their real intentions and about their ongoings on the front line. What we do know is, as you say, Ukraine started this invasion almost 2 weeks ago. It's around 11 days. And they made a lot of headway. I mean, they're now about 21 miles into Russian territory. They captured about 80 settlements. Almost at least 50,000 Russians had to be evacuated from their villages and their small cities. The terrain seems to be extremely favorable for invading it, because it can be easily held between swamps and lakes with a couple of roads which you control. It's a major setback for Russia, which was taken by surprise. It was officially, or is basically, planned by the Ukrainian command. It's not a sideline incursion, which we saw before by volunteer troops or by some kind of freewheeling military units. The Ukrainians also keep in their lines. It kept us in the West surprised, because we obviously neither the US nor the European commands were notified about what's coming. And now here we are watching whether Russia will react properly or not, and in what kind of scale. Right now, there isn't a kind of organized retaliation or attempt by Russia to push back that incursion, which basically tells us that Russia is extremely taken by surprise. But nevertheless, Russia hasn't given up its other attempts to increase pressure and settle front lines in other regions. And most importantly, in the Donetsk region, which is the southern region of the terrain invaded, Russia is about to complete a major success near a small town called Pokrovsk, which would give them control over most of the Donetsk region, which is one of their most or the highest stated war goals. They're about 8 miles now from that city. So we do see movements on all front lines. We do see this incursion, and now there's speculation what are the aims and what are the risks. Definitely what Ukraine has achieved until now is that Russia is being put under defense, that the political leadership is rattled. It's basically destabilizing command structures. It's destabilizing Putin's view of being in control of that war. It is increasing Ukrainian morale, which was extremely under pressure over the past weeks and months since the Russian onslaught was ongoing and not stopping. Ukraine has proven that it is able to take the initiative, to turn the table, to set the rules new, and the aim might be that Ukraine wants to force Russian troops to deploy differently, to ease pressure in the Donbass and Donetsk region, where the Ukrainian front is under heavy pressure. It might be that they want to boost morale domestically amongst their own military, and this is proven from the reports we do read that Ukrainians are hugely euthanized by that gamble. And now the question is, will they hold it, and what for? The Ukrainian official side, President Zelensky, foreign minister, and the command have publicly stated they are not invading Russia to hold territory, but they're totally aware of the psychological and also historical impact of this invasion. Ivo, you said that this is the first time since World War II that Russian terrain, key terrain of Russia, is being invaded. This must be a shock to the Russians. And as a German, I have to say the region we are talking about, the Kursk region, was the location, was the terrain of one of the last major tank battles in World War II, where Germany really was battling Russia. This has a couple of side implications, like can our tanks, which we supply to Ukraine, be used there? What kind of political dilemma does this pose to the West, to Germany? The same debate is taking place in Britain, probably not as much in the US, but it is taking place here in Europe. Now the question is, what is Ukraine aiming at? Apart from showing force and forcing Russia to deploy and to reassess their goals. It's definitely might be sort of the first down payment for a political movement we all expect for later in the year, probably after the US election. So is this already a signal towards peace negotiations, swap of land? Will there be a tit for tat? Will that basically make Vladimir Putin rethink his strategic goal of taking the eastern part of Ukraine and not really committing to an ongoing ceasefire? It is, however, also a gamble of the Ukrainian side, because they are weakening their own defense. They're stretching thin, and they might not be able to hold this terrain. They're not trying to dig in, to build trenches, to build defenses, set up a political and military control post in that region. But nevertheless, it is an uncontrolled escalation. And this uncontrolled escalation might lead to an uncontrolled answer by Vladimir Putin, who's definitely raging on what's happening. And it might also, in the meantime, in the mid-term, shift public opinion, probably especially in the West here, where now the narrative can be from Russian propaganda. Look at Ukraine; they're occupying territory as well. They're on the offensive. This is sort of an eye-to-eye war between two neighbors, and you should stay out of it. So the clear defensive character, the clear character of being the victims of this war, is changing slightly. I don't see any lasting damage on this for Ukraine, but let's see how this plays out over time. And so for now, it is a highly fascinating maneuver by the Ukrainians. But we all wonder whether they really follow a strategic goal or whether it just is sort of pincing the needle and just making them feel the pain of being invaded.
Stefan, that's a great summary with lots of issues that are raised here, and this is one of those questions where we certainly have a hell of a lot more questions than we do have answers. Ravi, I think one of the issues that Stefan rightly pointed at is sort of how should the West, particularly those who are providing the key armaments, the U.S., Germans, others who were that were being used in this very, very successful combined arms maneuver effort, the kind of thing we had hoped they were going to do in last summer in Ukraine itself, now against Russia. How is and how should Western countries be reacting to this?
Yeah, so I think Stefan summed up things really nicely. It's a challenge for the West because there is a clear risk of escalation, sometimes overstated, but worth considering, that once this turns from purely a defensive Ukrainian war into an offensive one, how that changes Russia's behavior. But if you look at the last 2.5 years, for example, the nuclear fear, which remains a fear, one could argue has often been overstated. And in a sense, the West has, gamed out bit by bit to see how much they can escalate their support over time. And I suspect they'll continue doing that. I don't think they were consulted on this particular incursion into Russia. And so it's interesting to see how Kyiv is trying to take matters into its own hands. I mean, one of the things that is very clear as a dynamic in this war of the last 2 years is the role of defense and offense. So Ukraine, of course, has been on the defensive throughout. That's like a bigger picture aspect of this war. But at a micro level, when you go a little bit deeper into what the war has entailed, it is actually easier to hold on to territory than it is to capture new territory. And I think the Russians have discovered this the hard way in Ukraine. The Ukrainians have discovered this as well in their sort of counter-offensive in Ukraine and in earlier sort of mini incursions into Russia. This one, I think, changes the game a bit in that it's a pretty big amount of territory, upwards of 1,000 square kilometers at this point. In taking the war to Russia, it sort of punches any complacency that might have been building among Russians. It changes the overall defensive versus offensive nature of the war in that it makes that a little bit more equal, just a tiny bit more equal, of course. Don't want to overstate what's happening here. But it's a fascinating new chapter, I think, which could open up a range of possibilities. It could open up Ukraine conducting more such incursions into other areas of Russia that are weak and not defended properly. But I think the thing that we shouldn't forget as well, from a hopeful perspective, is that this could also lead to better leverage for Ukraine in a potential what should I call it? I don't want to call it a peace deal, but in some sort of settlement between Russia and Ukraine. And if you look back at history, soil and land has always been very important leverage. If you look, we've mentioned World War II a few times here now, but in the past, if you look at the Polish-Soviet War in 1921, Soviet Russia, it stopped moving westward only after Poland occupied portions of Soviet territory, and that's something that I think will be on the minds of all of the players in this particular war. And then, you can contrast that with the Finnish-Soviet War, where, the Finns weren't able to occupy Soviet territory. So land, I think, here is going to play some sort of a psychological role, some sort of a role in any potential advances that could be made in a future settlement. That will be very high up on Zelensky's mind, on Putin's mind. And of course, lastly, Putin in the past has reacted in unpredictable, brutal ways to setbacks, and we should be ready for an unpredictable and brutal response to this as well. Maybe not immediately, but at some point.
Carla, I think the last point that Ravi raises is really sort of a critical piece on how does Russia react, because it's been in many ways our anticipation of Russia's reaction to Ukrainian and other actions that has informed what weapons we would provide, at what point, and for what purpose, in the belief that Putin had certain red lines that, if crossed, would lead to serious consequences. And one of those red lines we all thought was one of them was territorial conquest by Ukraine using Western equipment. And we're seeing it right now. And the interesting thing, 11 days into this war, is a flummoxed response, I think is the best way to put it, as opposed to a serious escalation. Does this tell us that red lines turn out to be pretty darn pink, and or that Putin bluffs and you call his bluff? Or are we just waiting for his response? How do you look at it?
There's no way knowing. I mean, it's sort of terrifying. I don't want to, you always want to jinx it because the consequences are so enormously terrifying. But when you think about it, the Biden administration, and Ivo, you've written so much about this and so persuasively, the Biden administration has been self-deterring from the very beginning, and then eventually gives more and more to the Ukrainians. But by slowing down the process, they've really hobbled the Ukrainian ability even to defend themselves. And the equipment that they finally got around to giving the Ukrainians, they said to them, you can hit the Russians with guided munitions, but you can only go up to 40 miles. They gave them these ATACMS, which had a 200-mile range, but they said, but you couldn't go all the way that far into Russia, which would make an enormous difference with these glide bombs, with the ability to deliver these things that have had such a destructive effect on civilian infrastructure, on just killing people. They have been so self-deterring, even as they've given them more and more equipment. They've said to them, you can use it here, you can't use it there. Now, suddenly the Ukrainians, without telling the Americans, without telling even the Europeans who've been saying to them, yeah, go use our equipment, we don't care if you use it against the Russians. Without telling anyone, they went and did the one thing that everyone said was definitely going to provoke Putin. They've gone into Russia itself, and Putin hasn't responded, but that doesn't mean in the next 10 minutes he's not going to respond. Nobody knows. This has been this incredible calculation. And how much of what they've done is because they're worried about Trump coming in. They're in this last sort of roll of the dice. We don't even know what's going on inside of Zelensky's mind. But to go back also to what Ravi and Stefan were saying, if they could hold this territory, and I am personally skeptical, but I'm not a military expert, but if they could hold this territory, it does pose a pretty big military question for the Russians, because suddenly this notion of invulnerability they have for their own territory goes away. And they're going to have to rethink how they deploy their own forces, because they have this border here that they've just taken for granted. And if they start putting conscripts in, that has a political implication. I mean, they have taken for granted the notion of the inviolability of their own border. Now, if the Ukrainians pull back, that probably goes away. But I think that's something really interesting to watch.
Yeah, I agree with that. And in terms of a strategic change here, I think it has exposed also the myth that Russia has had. They actually are not defending their borders. They're not defending it against Ukraine, which is why this was so successful. By the way, they're not defending it against NATO. All the troops that were opposite Finland have been moved out and put into Ukraine. They're putting everything in their Ukrainian basket, and they're being called upon. Stefan, last point back to you on anything that Ravi or Carla said, as well as you did say there was the beginnings of a debate in Germany about the sensitivity of using German equipment, particularly Leopard tanks, I guess, not only because of the Battle of Kursk that you mentioned, but just this defensive versus offensive nature of the conflict and how it is seen. So anything you want to add on that as well?
Well, the extremely complicated argument on defensive and offensive is probably has something in the German public that you can't make a distinction here, and this is a war where we defend ourselves. So I'm surprised that this is not it is not really taking hold, that debate. But wait and see. We will have major regional elections in 2 weeks' time in East Germany, and the major debate now in these campaigns is about our support for Ukraine in that war. And all these East German voters in Saxony and Thuringia are putting the vote in line with an argument by mostly the extreme left or the extreme right, which is pro-Russian. And so you do see a groundswell in the population, which is affected by these arguments. So we'll see whether Russian propaganda will play out of it. The leadership, the government in Berlin, is still holding the line, and it's not engaging in this debate. There's still a summer break. Next week, they'll return to parliament, and we'll see how this plays out. But I found Ravi's argument most striking. Historically, this is the nightmare per se for Putin. This is about Russian fatherland. This is now invaded. And what Carla said about protecting the border and basically all these neighborhood wars Putin fought in his tenure, Ukraine only the latest, but Georgia, all the others, were all about basically building the buffer zone. And that buffer zone doesn't hold. It can never hold because Russia is too vast a terrain to be defended and to be held militarily by buffers or by proxies or by frozen conflicts. So he sees the vulnerability. And I am most sort of curious now how this intrusion will play out internally in Moscow. Within the machine, Putin will definitely hit at his generals and his leadership, his military leadership group there, but they might also hit back because they do know that his war is unwinnable and his logic of defending the motherland is not tenable. So this is psychologically of utmost value.
Yeah, and conscripts are being killed and they're being taken prisoner. And that hasn't happened until now. And the only surprise is that Gerasimov is still sitting in his seat as the general, as the guy who has utterly failed in every way militarily that you could think about it. But I guess corruption. Actually, I mentioned earlier, I interviewed General Cavoli yesterday at Council on Foreign Relations. It was on the record, so I can say what he said. And he's the biggest surprise he said about the Russians is the depth of corruption in the Russian military and its ability to do anything. It is so deep, it's so entrenched, and that is one of the main reasons they have been as weak as they are. And of course, Putin and Gerasimov and everybody else are part of that very corrupt system. Fascinating thing to watch, but I think, as we've all underscored, a very, very potentially very dangerous moment in this war in a way that we haven't seen for a while. Dangerous it's been for Ukrainians, but now in larger parts as well. Talking about danger, Ravi, let's move to the Middle East, where surprisingly so far, Iran and Hezbollah have held their fire, at least in terms of retaliating against the assassinations of a senior Hezbollah and Hamas figure, including the Hamas political leader inside Tehran, and a hope that somehow, after what is now 8 months of very strong ongoing negotiations, we'll finally get to a ceasefire and a hostage deal. But the big question is, it looks like everybody in the world wants a deal except the two parties who are directly engaged in the conflict. At least Benjamin Netanyahu is making it difficult, and Hamas. Where are we, and how do you see this evolving?
This is a tough one. So where are we? We are well into now a second day of talks in Doha, in Qatar, and you have there the Qatari Prime Minister, representatives from the United States, Egypt, Israel. Hamas is not there, but the Qataris can ostensibly speak for them. So there are a few dimensions of this to get through, Ivo, and you touched on some of them. First, I think what is at stake. And this is the same that's been at stake for the last 10 months, except more and more and more. So Israel has continued to try and degrade Hamas in Gaza. Some 40,000 civilians have died. Gaza's largely destroyed. It is heartbreaking. Two, Israel remains sort of cowered in this primal crouch with their existence under threat and still hoping and praying that they can get their hostages back. But then three, there is, as you mentioned, this risk of a regional war that could escalate more and more. And that leads me to, I think, a larger point to make here, which is that the peace talks have been going on for quite a while. And in July, I think the Biden administration basically said that the war needs to end. Hamas's capabilities are degraded enough. What's happened since then, I think, has been predictable, but very worrying. So Israel and Hezbollah have been lobbing rocket fire at each other in a somewhat calibrated way. And, we've all been talking about that calibration, but designed to be a threat, not cause too much damage. I think that changed to some degree last month because we all thought a mistake will happen. And I don't know if this was a mistake or not, but a rocket from Lebanon hit a soccer field in a Druze village in Israeli-controlled Golan Heights. 12 teenagers and children died. And that sort of brings us to where we are here now. So Israel retaliates in Beirut by assassinating Hezbollah's commander, Fuad Shukr. That was seen as an escalation. The next day, Ismail Haniyeh, the political leader of Hamas, was in Tehran for the inauguration of Iran's new president. He was killed by a bomb that was planted there several months ago, I should say. And that was a real humiliation for Iran. A guest, however awful that guest, was killed on their soil. And this guest also happened to be a key participant in the peace talks, which makes progress less likely. It also means that amid these talks that are going on in Doha, and we've been waiting for several weeks now, Iran and its proxies may retaliate at any moment against Israel in some big way. And this retaliation could be a further escalation. It could be something that resembles an attack your listeners will remember in April when Iran launched hundreds of rockets and missiles at Israel, but we suspect they knew they would be intercepted. Iran doesn't want war, but it's also showing it doesn't quite want peace. And sadly, it's the same with Israel, as you pointed out at the start, which has in Netanyahu a prime minister who, at the very least has incentive to prolong the status quo and project himself as the only person who can keep Israel safe. So the hostages aren't coming back until there's a deal. And amid sort of what is clearly a tenuous deal process, the region's on a knife's edge. Conflict could easily escalate. But I would say even the most optimistic analysts are going to struggle to suggest we're going to have a breakthrough. And even if there is a breakthrough, I should point out, unlikely as it is, that's just a temporary bomb. I mean, the real issue of a bigger Middle East peace deal is probably further away than it's been in years.
It's a depressing but very realistic picture there, Carla. How do you see it? It seems to me that the administration has been in a bind for 10 months, and partly of its own making, but partly of the need of the reality of the situation, which is it's had two fundamental goals: supporting Israel and avoiding a regional war. And it is increasingly tenuous, and it's tried to square that circle over and over and over again because Israeli counteractions have escalated to the point in which a regional war is becoming more and more likely. And how much longer can the administration try to figure out how to square the circle when it's pretty clear it's a circle and it doesn't fit in a square hole?
I sort of see this relationship with Bibi Netanyahu as like Holmes and Moriarty going over the falls together. I mean, it's just, you're caught in this like death embrace. It's just, when Bibi came and gave that talk to Congress, uninvited, not invited by the White House, I mean, there had been some hope that he might at least acknowledge this, this peace plan, the ceasefire for hostages deal that Biden unveiled and said it was an Israeli plan in the first place. And he didn't even mention it. It was all about Iran. And wink, wink, nod, nod, I'm about to kill, Haniyeh in Tehran. I mean, this was he is, incorrigible. And this administration has gone from wanting a legacy-shaping grand bargain between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which they thought Bibi would want, that would be legacy-shaping for him, and who knows, maybe even a get-out-of-jail card for him. And now they're desperate to, get to the first phase of a ceasefire. At a minimum, because that's the best chance of avoiding a regional war, because Iran, which also doesn't want a regional war, is saying if you can get to that first phase, we won't have to retaliate in a massive way. And if you talk to people in the White House right now, their number one fear beyond a regional war is protesters in the streets of your city, Ivo, about the Gaza war, because it's rending apart potentially. The Democrats have done fabulously since the handoff from Biden to Harris. They're unified except on this one topic of Gaza. And that can tear the party apart, and particularly if you've got massive demonstrations in the streets of Chicago over Gaza. So for this, it's a political nightmare for them, terrible fear of a regional war. And you've gone from massive legacy shaping notion as, can we just hold it together until the election?
I think that's, but events, dear boy, events, as they say, keep on interfering. Stefan, Europe is the German foreign minister, the French foreign minister, and leaders. Everyone has been screaming off the top of their heads, warning that this is the point at which things can go really, really, really bad.
Right, but no one is listening.
But no one is listening. Right. It is remarkable that we are finding the sense of in which the region itself is driving the dynamic, and the inability to do it on the outside. What does this say about European leverage? What does it say about American leverage in your sense? And what's the debate like? And how long can support for Israel / Netanyahu hold out, given as Ravi rightly reminded ourselves, the destruction in Gaza and the political debates that we're having in the Democratic Party here clearly are happening in Europe as well.
Well, support is now has thinned out very much, and even Germany, which has its special historical relation with Israel, is having a hard time justifying special relations and backing the Netanyahu government. So this doesn't happen, but definitely Europe is on the stands in this. We're just watchers. We're not actors. Europe is not really having an impact in anything. It's not present in the talks. There are public statements, there's political talk, but there's no listening and there's no impact. So the leverage has pretty much been exhausted. The interesting thing to watch from those stands, however, I think, is that America still matters. At the moment, the Biden administration pulled together all forces in the Mediterranean and sent the submarine and basically threatened to be there militarily. The threat of war didn't disappear, but at least decreased, because those who are basically sitting on those, those who are making the decision now in Hezbollah and Iran, have understood that the price they would have to pay themselves might be too high, especially with change in leadership in Iran. There seems to be now an open debate on how much the country is able to expose itself without being damaged in its power structure. My paper just was lucky to have somebody in Tehran for the handover ceremony in the presidency, and did some research there. And so the kind of views you get is that the need for for surviving the situation, or basically the fear of being drawn into an uncontrolled situation which costs your own power base, is so high that the kind of balance they now hold in threatening with war but not really being willing to wage it is exactly the most you can get. And so I think the worst outcome will be that we do have this war in sight situation going on for weeks and weeks and months, but never really being resolved in either way. So it's not, there won't be an open war, a big war, but there won't be a peace situation either. And the question is, how can the US, which is definitely having the tools in its hand, break that stalemate? And there were now 2 days of negotiations. They have closed them down for this week. They will convene again next week. That's just coming. I don't see any new idea. I don't see any fresh idea diplomatically how to break that up. And but militarily, we're in a cul-de-sac there as well. So I think it's a bleak situation. It's basically the threat of full destruction which keeps us from full destruction.
Well, you hope that is the case until that threat no longer is sufficient. I think the real fundamental core problem is that everyone wants this war to end. That is true for Iran. It's true for Hezbollah. It's true for all of his proxies, except Hamas and the far right in the Israeli cabinet, to which Netanyahu is beholden politically. You could even argue that Netanyahu wants it, but he doesn't. He cares more about power than he cares about staying in power, than he cares about the conduct of the war. And so, how you get a negotiation in which neither the two sides that have to agree don't agree, and in fact, in Hamas's case, what they would like to see, of course, is a regional escalation, because that would reduce the Israeli pressure on them and isolate Israel even more. I don't know how you solve that problem, particularly since the Israelis don't seem to have a viable political strategy or military strategy to end the war in Gaza, as we're seeing, because every day they have to go back into places that were, quote, cleansed of Hamas, because Hamas is back. And I think that's the fundamental conundrum that has been with us since day one. The strategy Israel has pursued can't work. As long as they're pursuing it, Hamas is not defeated. In fact, in some ways, they win, which is the core of the issue. Anyway, I'm sure we'll be back next week and the week after this, because it is too important not to talk about, even if it's not always with that much hope in the end. Carla, let's turn last, but certainly not least, to what is happening in the information space. It so happens that it's gone forward because the FBI announced a major hack, an attempt, and one attempt and one successful hack of presidential campaigns. But this is a much bigger and larger issue that I know you've been thinking about and writing and talking about. So tell us where we are and how we should think about the issue of information and disinformation within the digital space as a fundamental challenge to our societies.
So we learned about this when the Trump campaign announced that some of its communications were hacked by what it said was Iran, after Politico and the Washington Post reported that they'd received internal documents, opposition research on now GOP vice presidential candidate J.D. Vance. The FBI then put out a very brief statement. They said they'd begun investigating it in June. What they said were hacks of both the Biden and Trump campaigns, or efforts to hack them. And on Wednesday, the Google Threat Analysis Group wrote that APT42, which is an Iranian hacking group, had targeted, and I'll read this quote, the personal email accounts of roughly a dozen individuals affiliated with President Biden and with former President Trump. So I think several things really stand out about this that are intriguing. One is there's definite irony here about Trump complaining about getting hacked, given his "what about her emails" mantra in 2016. At a minimum, you think that the Trump campaign would be better about hygiene, cyber hygiene, given their experience. Add to the fact that, I love this, the Iranians appear to have gotten access to their campaign communications via Roger Stone, who's one of the strangest Republican operatives of our lifetime. This is the guy who's got the Nixon tattoo on his back. And he's also the one who's convicted of 7 felonies, mainly for trying to get Hillary Clinton's emails out of WikiLeaks. Trump pardoned him on his way out the door. But Ivo, as you said, we're going to see, I suspect, a lot more hacking efforts, a lot more leaking to come. The DNI has warned that Iran, China, and Russia are all trying to pollute the campaign space. And that's going to raise, I think, the really fundamental question we were talking about before we came on. Has the press grown more sophisticated or more chastened? Will the public even notice amid the cacophony out there anyway? And, I think the cacophony is the biggest thing because there's going to be a whole rash of disinformation. There already is deep fakes, election denialism, a lot of it generated by foreign actors, but a lot of it is homegrown. The FBI is back flagging foreign influence campaigns to the social media companies. You recall they'd stopped for a while because this case was in front of the Supreme Court because Republican attorney generals said you couldn't talk to the social media companies because that was going to be censorship of conservative thought. And that's a game of whack-a-mole. I mean, you can take down sites, FSB sites, and they're going to pop up again. But the FBI is not going to do anything about homegrown interference. They've already said this. They're not going to be calling balls and strikes. They're going to leave that up to local officials. You recall during the New Hampshire primary, there was that Biden robocall. The New Hampshire Attorney General was really good, warning people about it. But the feds aren't going to do it because they don't want to be seen meddling in the campaign. So I think we're going to see a lot of this. Some of it's going to be foreign. A lot of it is going to be domestic. And I just think that we're in a really different place from 2016. The good news, I think people are somewhat more sophisticated. The bad news, I think people are so cynical that even if something's true, I think people are going to be skeptical about it. If people say to you, that is actually an AI-generated sex tape of that candidate, you shouldn't pay attention to, they'll say you're lying. And if someone says, here's something really true, they'll also say you're lying, because we really are in sort of this post-truth phase, and that is not great for democracy.
Stefan, you're reporting out of Germany. I mean, there is the digital warfare is happening in every country that has an open press and an open political system, and there's a constant battle between regulation and the ability to a government regulation, the ability to say what you want in our open societies. We're not China, we're not Russia, we're not Iran, for that matter. How is this debate playing out? You have big elections coming up. You mentioned 3 regional elections, and of course a national election in 2025. How is the German debate about it? And as an editor, how do you think about publishing hacked materials if you think it's important that people know about it?
Well, we're not publishing without checking and without sort of balancing. We would never do the WikiLeaks thing because this was unproportional and not counterfact checked and doing more harm than good. But nevertheless, the main problem isn't leaks. The main problem now is the hybrid warfare which is being waged on with these means, the destabilization of society, and some kind even the bluntness, how open these things happen. We now had 2 occasions here over the past weeks or days where Germany was rattled by these kind of hybrid things. There was a warning on air bases being infiltrated by Russian agents, by Russian spies here in the West. And you remember the Paris Olympics were a threat all over Russia being in that place and trying to do harm. Now, we had this story on 2-3 air bases being infiltrated and water would be polluted there. And just the fear of that, the kind of how that news spread, we haven't really dug through the facts yet, whether it was basically a hybrid attack just pressed on via social media or other medias, or whether it was a true a real attack. This caused basically almost hysteria with the German armed forces and created a state of heightened alert now, which we still have as today. The second one is a much blunter thing. And it goes back to what Carla said about free speech, and how will free speech be the end of free speech because there's too much of it? And we do have the right-wing party AfD, which is right extremist, and it's watched by our security forces and by the intelligence forces because they want a different state, they want to end democracy, and they're riding high in the polls. They did run officially a magazine called Compact, which was basically spreading hatred, fear, and lies. And that was clearly stated, calling for a different state. And that magazine was forbidden by the German Home Ministry. And just 2 days ago, a high court, one of the high courts in Germany, took back that ban of the magazine and said, this is violating free speech. If you ban that with that basis of proof you have, you need to be better on this. I don't think you can't be much better than just reading it and finding what they write. And it's outrageous. It is all false. It's spreading lies. But even in Germany, where free speech and where this high wire walk on sort of spreading lies and destabilizing democracy is really spelled through in all the laws we have, in all the rulings of the Constitutional Court and others, also due to our own historical experiences. Now, again, we do fall back in that trap, and we need to justify on our sophisticated democratic level why we shouldn't read a magazine like Compact, which is clearly right-wing extremist.
Free speech, I'm going to keep this one. Will free speech be the end of free speech? Ravi, you too are an editor of a magazine. You rely on free speech. You rely on that ability. And yet, how do you get through this information space in a way that enables people to know what they're reading is true and or not? How do you deal with that? And we don't have a lot of time because this is a big issue. But your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm lucky. I edit Foreign Policy magazine, and I'm lucky that most of my readers have already read the Times and the Post and their local publications wherever they are in the world. So they're not really coming to us for true or false or the basic facts, but more sort of second order analysis, which means like I don't have to adjudicate sort of facts day to day the way, say, a newspaper editor would, or that I have in previous jobs as a journalist. I think, where I think I can leave this in a way that might be somewhat sort of constructive is every country is dealing with this issue at some form or the other. Many years ago in another life, I wrote a book about how the smartphone was transforming India. And some of that book was hopeful. Some of it was deeply pessimistic about what happens when you put new technology in the hands of someone for whom that new technology is their first map, their first Walkman, their first MP3 player, their first TV, their first video screen, their first computer, all of those things in once. It's an amazing amount of progress in a short amount of time, which has a lot of good. What we're talking about now is the downsides. And I think the entire world at various degrees and levels has ignored tech literacy and media literacy. And, as an editor, I find it stunning that regular people I meet day to day don't know what a dateline is, aren't able to distinguish between a newswire piece and a piece that was written by and commissioned by a magazine or a newspaper themselves, aren't able to gauge when they click on something on the internet whether it looks dodgy and is dodgy or whether it's reliable, aren't able to think about, okay, I read this newspaper, what are its sources of funding? How do I trust? Basic media literacy, I think, is something that every country, every school should be investing in a massive way. Again, in this previous life, when I wrote this book, I did propose a tax on tech companies, smartphone companies that make a lot of money off of the proliferation of media and technology to invest in digital literacy and media literacy. Obviously, that hasn't happened. But I think that really is the root cause of, or at least would be a root defense for a lot of the problems we're discussing. Countries can do what they do. Companies can do what they do. Microsoft, America, whatever it is in this particular case, communities need to invest.
Well, that's indeed a very constructive, potentially hopeful, if taken up, way to end a much too brief discussion about a very, very important issue. I really want to thank Ravi Agrawal of Foreign Policy, Carla Robbins of the Council on Foreign Relations, and Stefan Kornelius of Süddeutsche Zeitung, and all of you for tuning in. Great discussion, some good, some bad, a lot of it depressing, but that's what the world is today, unfortunately. We'll be back next week with another edition of World Review. In fact, we'll be live from Chicago next week with our edition from World Review, and hope you will tune in. And if you happen to be in Chicago, hope you join us. And until then, we hope you all have a great weekend. Thanks so much.